After all that build-up, here comes the dampener. The big breaking news we're tracking this hour. In a stunning move, the US President Donald Trump has cancelled the June 12th summit meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong Un in Singapore. The US President scrapped the summit hours after North Korea warned that it is up to the Americans to continue with the summit. Mr. Trump said, I quote, "I was very much looking forward to being there with you. Sadly, based on the tremendous anger and open hostility displayed in your most recent statement, I feel it is inappropriate at this time to have this long-planned meeting." End quote. Citing the threat issued by North Korea's Vice Foreign Minister, he said, I quote again, "You talk about your nuclear capabilities, but ours are so massive and powerful that I pray to God that they will never have to be used." End quote. Right, let me go across first to Professor Swaran Singh, who's joining us from South Korea itself. Professor Singh, of course, is from the School of International Studies at the prestigious JNU in India. Professor Swaran Singh, I had all these questions lined up for you about the China factor to all of this, but it's all been turned on its head thanks to President Trump. Your first reaction to him deciding to pull out of the Singapore summit, are you surprised?
I am not surprised because we are used to his whimsical tweets and statements. And I also don't see this as end of the tunnel in that sense. I think they are going to continue to build pressure on both sides. The sense that I get here in South Korea among scholars is that nobody really believes that Kim Jong Un is planning to give up his nuclear weapons. And that sense must have also reached the United States in some ways. So basically, the newspapers here are talking about the tussle being between requirement of Kim Jong Un for survival and prosperity.
I apologize for cutting you off. The U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is speaking. Let's cut across to that Congress testimony that's going on. Listen in.
Actually agree to dismantlement in exchange for all the benefits to his economy and his people.
I met with the Chinese foreign minister yesterday afternoon. He assured me that they would continue to abide by all the UN Security Council resolutions relating to this, and that they understood that those needed to remain in place not till June 12th. At this point, we were talking about, in the context there being a summit on June 12th, but not only through June 12th, but until such time as we achieved what it was the Americans believed. And I think, frankly, that China agrees would be the outcome that is best for the world and the best for North Korea as well.
Are you getting any hints that there's any relaxation of those sanctions, more goods crossing between the border, between China and North Korea?
Senator, we haven't seen anything to suggest they've violated the Security Council resolutions in a substantial way. I worry about everyone. The global pressure campaign that is put in place is important and needs to continue. Perhaps even this morning more than yesterday. That's very important so that we can ultimately get to the right place here.
What gave me some measure of optimism is, from my standpoint, I think it's entirely in China's best interest to achieve exactly what the administration is demanding here.
Senator, that's what their foreign minister told me yesterday as well, unambiguously believes that. He told me that China believes that the denuclearization of North Korea is in China's best interest.
Well, let me just say I support President Trump's letter. I think it's an excellent letter. We need to make sure that Kim Jong Un understands that we are completely consistent. We will absolutely demand that, and that all the benefits that can flow to North Korea will not occur until we achieve our definition that he is well aware of, crystal clear, of complete dismantlement. So again, thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I would ask consent that statements from Refugees International and Catholic Relief Services be made part of our record.
Without objection.
Mr. Secretary, let me just follow up on North Korea for one moment. And that is, in response to Senator Johnson, you indicated that you're trying to convince the North Koreans that their security is going to be better served without nuclear weapons. And I fully support that. It's very possible if diplomacy is successful, it will require action by the United States Congress in order to deal with some of these issues. During the discussions on the Iran nuclear agreement, my Republican colleagues thought that this should be a treaty type of an arrangement, which would require the two-thirds vote of the United States Senate. My question to you is, how do you intend to keep Congress informed during these negotiations, considering the questions that Senator Menendez asked were ones that I would have asked also, and we have not had the in-depth type of briefings that would be, I think, required in these types of negotiations. So how do you envision keeping us informed, recognizing that during the Iran
Okay, we're going to dip back
Congress
into that conversation in just a bit. I'm also joined on the broadcast by Inter-Korean Affairs expert Robert Kelly. Dr. Kelly is joining us from South Korea itself. Dr. Kelly, good evening. Thanks for speaking with us at WION. The Senate testimony right now, questions being asked and of Mike Pompeo. But if there was ambiguity on the end game as far as what was expected from North Korea goes, why walk so far down the garden path to start with? Isn't this a huge loss of face for the United States?
I think it is for both sides. I think the North Koreans wanted this thing also. I think the Americans were a little bit too disorganized in the approach to this. We know that Donald Trump wasn't particularly deeply vested in the preparation of this. But yes, I think it is sort of a loss of face for the United States. The North Koreans, or Donald Trump, wanted this a lot. He impulsively agreed to this very quickly after it was proposed to him. We know that Donald Trump was excited for the theatricality and the drama of it. And the North Koreans just didn't come around. The North Koreans just didn't seem prepared to offer enough on denuclearization to get the president to come out. So, yes, I think it's actually bad for all sides.
And what about the fact that the nuclear test site was dismantled only hours earlier? The fact that the U.S. president himself says that he was thankful of North Korea for sending the hostages back. Doesn't it seem like the North was holding up its end of the bargain, but the U.S. wasn't playing ball?
Yeah, the thing about the hostages and the detonation of the site, I mean, those, to be honest, those are actually sort of fairly minor concessions. American hostages in North Korea have always been released in the past. The site itself may have been corrupted and damaged from previous tests. So these aren't actually really great concessions from the North Koreans. I mean, what the Americans really wanted was some kind of serious deal about denuclearization. At the very minimum, some sense of the shape of the program, how many missiles they have, the size of their nuclear stockpile, and inspectors, cameras back in the IAEA, something like that. And it just doesn't look like the North Koreans are going to move on that. And I think that's ultimately why Trump decided not to do it.
What do you expect to happen next?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. My sense is that this thing is going to be postponed rather than completely canceled. I still think the Americans want some kind of deal, right? I don't think anybody wants to go back to fire and fury and the rest of that like we had last year. I think certainly the South Korean public is strongly opposed to anything that looks like a war, and Donald Trump will ultimately be constrained by that, right? If the United States is going to be allied to South Korea, that means the United States has got to pay attention to South Korean public opinion, which is very much against a strike. So ultimately, I think the Trump administration will come back to some kind of negotiation. I'd be very surprised if this leads to strikes. I don't think we're quite there yet, but it certainly makes those strikes more likely. Okay, let's hope so. Robert Kelly, thank you for taking out the time to speak with us. Ray Locker is also with us on the broadcast, the national security editor of the USA Today, joining us from Washington. Professor Swaran Singh continues to be with us from Seoul in South Korea. Ray, to you first. Let's just talk a little bit about the statement itself from President Trump. He does start by couching, what he's saying in the niceties of thanking Mr. Chairman Kim Jong Un for his time, patience and effort. But then he talks about the nuclear capabilities of the United States as being massive and powerful, and praying to God that he doesn't ever have to use them. So the threat very much on the table once again.
Yeah, like there was before. So here we are, this is the way the president operates. As the previous commentators have mentioned, this is something that he kind of impulsively agreed to with no real planning. And now we're at a kind of an impulsive, at least postponement of the summit, if not an outright cancellation. I agree this could be a bargaining tactic to lead to something else. But, the stakes in this are very high, and this is not the way that normal presidents typically do their business.
Fair enough. Professor Swaran Singh, I'm just wondering, do you feel there's also in this letter a signal perhaps that the U.S. president and his policy makers are finally perhaps on the same page when it comes to tackling North Korea, something that, multiple reports have suggested hasn't been the case so far?
Yes, I would say that they look like on the same page, but on different points of that page, not on the same point on same page. And I think the biggest the person to worry today is the South Korean president, Moon Jae-in. I think he's been really making very serious efforts, behind the curtain. And I think he looks, a little disappointed today because this meeting was to happen. And only yesterday, he confirmed that the meeting will happen on 12th of June after his meeting with President Trump. But trust me, the way we know President Trump, you will have another tweet within 24 hours showing something completely different. So fundamentally, what we all know, everybody is here pursuing their own interests. And if you were to look at the common aggregate of all the powers and stakeholders involved, to keep the pot boiling is where they will all agree. They just want to keep engagement and stay in the news off and on. Look at President Trump. I think you must remember he has time till 2020, so he's not in a hurry to do it tomorrow. So this may be pressure tactics which is applied so far. He's been saying that he wants all agreement done in a short time is the concession he was making, that if you cannot do it by 12th of June, then maybe in a short time. And that's not how these things happen. And I think North Korean leader has been making serious concessions. And as you mentioned today, the destruction of the test site was being shown on CNN all the day. So here I think the attempt to use maximum pressure is continuing, and that is the reason why this has been sort of not clarified whether it is cancelled or postponed. But as everybody says, it's possibly postponed. It's going to come back again on the table. They're going to continue to build pressure on both sides. Both sides are trying to bargain fundamentally in their own fashion. Kim Jong Un wants prosperity and regime security. President Trump wants his rating to go up to do something historic by achieving some kind of an agreement which will be implemented much later. Now, this is not going to happen very quickly. So if by 2020 they're able to have a complete agreement signed on both sides, guaranteed by Chinese and Japanese and South Koreans.
Allow me to come in, Professor Singh. Eugene Scott of the Washington Post is also joining us from Washington, D.C. Eugene, thank you for speaking with us. Just yesterday, I spoke with a colleague of yours, David Nakamura, on that particular report that WashPo had done about, the nervousness on the North Korean side about the possibility of this summit. But there was also a reference to the reassuring that President Trump tried to do for Kim Jong Un, saying that he was going to make sure that he wouldn't be destabilized like Colonel Gaddafi. Keeping all of that in mind, does this statement come across as a complete U-turn from what was intended perhaps from the United States?
Well, I don't think it comes across as a complete U-turn. There was concern from Kim's camp about comments that Mike Pence made earlier this week in reference to Gaddafi that made them uncomfortable, and they wanted to know where the American government under Trump's leadership stood on this issue in terms of how they would respond to North Korea following the desire for North Korea to denuclearize. There's a lack of trust on both sides, considering the histories that both of the countries share. And so it's not surprising, quite frankly, to see everyone so jumpy, perhaps, given that these conversations are new and that there is not a lot of background or even familiarity from the Trump administration on the history of these policy issues related to North Korea.
Absolutely. The trust deficit has come up repeatedly. And I suppose, Ray Locker, that trust deficit has just, gone up tremendously, given the fact that President Trump has called out Kim Jong Un. He's laid blame on the quote-unquote tremendous anger and open hostility displayed in your most recent statement. But let's not forget, even the United States has repeatedly said that it is not going to back down, that the nuclear option is always available to it.
Right. I mean, these are two countries that have been in a state of war for 65 years, so it's not surprising that there is a lack of trust. When the vice president mentioned what happened with Libya, the North Koreans predictably reacted alarmingly, because they thought, look, what happened with Libya was Gaddafi was overthrown after he denuclearized, so they don't want that to happen to them either. Now, what happened intervening 8 years between denuclearization and the overthrow of Gaddafi was they got a lot of benefits from the United States, and I think that's what the vice president meant. But obviously the North Koreans are very leery of anything that looks like regime change, and I think they all know that deep down that's what the United States government has always wanted in North Korea, this administration and other ones before them.
Right. And Eugene, the fact that Kim met again very recently with the president of China, Xi Jinping, in Dalian, a summit that the United States was caught unaware about. And the fact that Sergei Lavrov of Russia, the foreign ministers, are going to be visiting North Korea at the end of the month. Have these developments also perhaps made the United States a little iffy, if you will, on the possibility of this summit, given the players that are involved?
Absolutely. There are real questions and concerns about the conversations between the leaders of North Korea and China and Russia. And there's some doubt that full transparency is taking place and that this information is being made available to the United States government. And there should be some concern considering the histories of all of these governments and their interactions with one another. I think what it has revealed to many critics of the Trump administration was that far too little legwork was done ahead of the planning of this summit before determining that this was something that needed to take place. There's more information that American leaders want to get from North Korea in terms of their agenda, their willingness to work with the American government, and what their ultimate outcome for all of this is, what they desire the outcome to be, should I say.
Absolutely. Professor Singh, Mike Pompeo referred to his meeting with China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi in that's testimony in front of Congress a short while ago. And it's interesting that he said that China was as committed to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula as the United States. That was, in my opinion, paraphrasing to a great degree, because China also put forth what it said was the need for the recognition of the legitimate security concerns of North Korea. Do you think that the China factor is something that is going to play up in the days to come, and something that will perhaps require more analysis when we're looking in retrospect at Mr. Trump's decision today?
I'm happy you brought up China. China is lately the reason, in fact, because President Trump directly mentioned that after second meeting of Kim Jong Un with President Xi Jinping, the tempers have changed. He mentioned in one of his speeches. And China has had standard policy saying that nuclear weapons of North Korea are a problem for United States. They should talk directly to each other and resolve this issue. Now, the problem is when they actually surprise Chinese by beginning to talk to each other. Now, Chinese were not very happy with it in that manner, because if they are able to resolve issues with North Korea, that means United States comes on the doorstep of Chinese on the border. So they wouldn't also be happy to see these things transforming in such a fashion that Kim Jong Un develops a kind of a very comfortable relationship with the United States. So multiple stakeholders are fundamentally pursuing their own interests. President Trump is looking for his ratings at home, for his 2020 second term possibility. China is looking to continue to be relevant and influential. Russia is trying to come into it as well now. And North Korea basically wants to ensure regime security. So everybody is trying to get as much of their interest as possible. And this is only pressure tactics that you're seeing now in terms of meeting being postponed. It is going to come up soon that meeting is going to be revived at a later stage, or something is going to happen, because President Donald Trump doesn't have too many cards to play at this stage. And this is a very important card in his hand to raise his ratings at home. And same is true of Kim Jong Un, who really wants desperately some kind of aid, some kind of investment in North Korea. And opening up of North Korea so that he can pursue his second policy of economic development.
Right.
So there are compulsions that are pushing these leaders. And I think that will show that they'll come back again to the talking table.
Right. And I wonder, Ray Locker, if the compulsions that have been placed on Kim Jong Un have also translated into that rhetoric sort of coming back into the public domain. There was relative silence following, statements of the fire and fury kind from last year in the last couple of weeks. But then we hear a senior member of the Kim administration calling Mike Pence a political dummy. What do you make of that?
Well, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. So people talk at each other. They use a lot of overheated language. This is common in U.S.-North Korean relations. It's not surprising that it happens again. And it's not really a deterrent to a summit. I mean, this happens routinely. So it could mean something, or it could mean nothing. We could have a summit back on any minute now. That's the nature of these two very impulsive leaders. I would imagine that Kim Jong Un is playing more of a long game than Donald Trump is, because that's the nature of Kim versus Trump. but it's really hard to tell.
Fair enough. Eugene Scott, what do you expect is going to happen next? I'm just trying to wrap my head around everything that's changed so quickly, from the fire and fury kind of statements from last year, then to this bonhomie on display, and then, of course, this damp squib, if you will. I was really looking forward to June 12th.
Yeah, I think what the Trump administration is going to do is make it clear to their base, primarily the American people more broadly, what it is exactly that they wanted from North Korea, what they were hoping to get after negotiation and perhaps some compromise, and what North Korea would not do and would not submit to. I think for the most part, what we're going to see in the next couple of days is a PR campaign that won't make the Trump administration look as if they've been had or been played by the North Korean government. But what other individuals in the Trump administration who were truly hoping to see some improvement in international relations will be working on is how to move this conversation forward. Because in the letter that the president wrote, it's very possible that a summit could happen in the future, and there's still interest from this side in trying to find some common ground between the two countries.
All right, Eugene, Ray, and Professor Singh, I'll request the three of you to stay on with me a while longer. I just want to play out for our viewers once more Mike Pompeo's statement on the president's letter to Kim Jong Un. Let's listen in.
I begin this hearing today by reading a letter that the State Department recently transmitted to Chairman Kim and North Korea. The letter is to Chairman Kim Jong Un, Chairman of the State Affairs Commission of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And it reads as follows: Dear Mr. Chairman, we greatly appreciate your time, patience, and effort with respect to our recent negotiations and discussions relative to a summit long sought by both parties, which was scheduled to take place on June 12th in Singapore. We are informed that the meeting was requested by North Korea, but that to us is totally irrelevant. I was very much looking forward to being there with you. Sadly, based on the tremendous anger and open hostility displayed in your most recent statement, I feel it is appropriate at this time to have this long-planned meeting, or inappropriate, excuse me. I feel it is inappropriate at this time to have this long-planned meeting. Therefore, please let this letter serve to represent that the Singapore summit, for the good of both parties, but to the detriment of the world, will not take place. You talk about your nuclear capabilities, but ours are so massive and powerful that I pray to God they will never have to be used. I felt that a wonderful dialogue was building up between you and me, and ultimately is only that dialogue that matters. Someday, I look very much forward to meeting you. In the meantime, I want to thank you for the release of the hostages who are now home with their families. That was a beautiful gesture and was very much appreciated. If you change your mind having to do with this important summit, please do not hesitate to call me or write. The world, and North Korea in particular, has lost a great opportunity for lasting peace and great prosperity and wealth. This missed opportunity is a truly sad moment in history. Sincerely yours, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States of America.
Right, so the U.S. Secretary of State there reading out the letter, the same U.S. Secretary of State who's actually met with Kim Jong Un in the recent past. Professor Singh, a question now on the impact on the region itself. How disappointed or worried do you think South Korea is going to be with this development?
I think of all people, as I mentioned, the most worried person today perhaps is Moon Jae-in. He yesterday said in detail that as on Friday, which is tomorrow, those air defense exercises called Max Thunder finish, North Korea is going to come back and sober down and we'll restart negotiations, because bilateral inter-Korean negotiations had also been halted because of these air exercises. And in Washington, he said that he's one person working behind the scenes, and I think he has something to really worry about today, because in any tension rising, South Korea is next door, and his party has always supported North Korea's overtures to come out and talk to the world, and also for unification. Maybe Kim Jong Un will come back, as the letter ends by saying he can write back to President Trump, or some feelers from other levels will go back and negotiations will come to happen again. But it seems that the momentum that was generated, particularly with efforts of South Korean president, has halted as of now, and that's not a good news for South Korea. North Korea, again, I think had already shown certain amount of commitment to make concessions and really deliver those concessions, including destruction of the test site today. But apparently, President Trump was not seeing what he expected to come out from 12th June meeting, and therefore he had to find ways and means. So excuses like blaming the Chinese or blaming North Koreans when the United States and South Korea are actually having air exercises, which is a provocative thing to do in such a negotiating strategy. So it's looking for excuses from American side at this stage because they were not looking at outcome that is acceptable to them at this stage. But that's not end of the story. I'm saying repeatedly, it will come back again sooner or later, because for Trump, he has to do something interesting before 2020. And I'm saying he doesn't have too many other cards to play. So North Korea is a good card for America to play at this stage.
Fair enough.
So negotiations will come back. I'm even saying wait till next 24 hours, maybe another two it is coming.
It's an interesting point you raise, and in fact we're hearing now that Moon Jae-in has called for an urgent meeting with some of his top aides. That's the report that's coming in right now. Ray Locker, Shinzo Abe, Japan too is of course deeply invested in these talks and the outcomes of them. How do you see Shinzo Abe and the Japanese people reacting to this development, considering some of the most pointed rhetoric from the North Koreans has been directed towards Japan?
Well, I think they're obviously concerned, and they've expressed those concerns to the U.S. government and to their counterparts in South Korea. I also think Shinzo Abe and his administration are well aware of how President Trump operates. They've factored that into all their planning. They've been very, very careful to cultivate President Trump and make sure they know what he's doing. The people in the Japanese embassy in Washington have been really on top of this from the beginning, trying to get a good sense of Trump. So I don't think they were taken by surprise by this, because I don't think most of us were taken by surprise. So I think they're watching, they're talking, and trying to get a good read on it, because the outcome for them is to get rid of the nukes in North Korea because they're under constant threat.
Fair enough. And I guess part of the surprise, not really being that surprising, Eugene, is the involvement of Mike Pompeo and John Bolton. I mean, the moment their names were announced for the respective posts that they hold, there were question marks raised on whether or not this peace accord will come to anything, given their hawkish personalities and their hawkish stance when it comes to the North.
Absolutely. These individuals were chosen for these positions for their hawkish views on global issues, especially with countries that the United States has historically not had the best relationships with. But I think it's really important from those within Trump world, and I mean specifically supporters who perhaps are not as informed on the history of these international affairs issues, is that North Korea and their leadership as we have seen, have no problem with responding with equally as tough, if not controversial language to policymakers and ideas that they find troublesome and problematic. And so the tough talk that led people to vote for Donald Trump and get him in the White House, it will not always be met with people globally, leaders globally, just cowing to that and bowing down to every word that comes out of this Trump administration. But as we have seen, sometimes quite the opposite.
Right. Professor Singh, as we're sort of, let's say, winding down on this conversation, I want to ask you, in retrospect, do you think there's a lot of lessons to be learned for both North Korea and the United States, looking back at the way this meeting was approached and the pace, perhaps, at which developments took place leading up to the possibility of the summit?
All sides have walked a sufficient number of miles already. Those chemistries, bonhomies, understandings are not going to disappear. When they restart again talking to each other, they have this backup to start from. So it's not going to be completely fresh slate to start from. So this experience has really added on to as to how they can work together. And whenever they come back, that experience will help them to really push it forward. And it looks like John Bolton, by talking of Libyan model, had rattled North Korean a great deal because regime security is very critical to them. And that was a very, very strange and silly example because Libya only had blueprints, whereas North Korea today has a nuclear deterrence which can reach Washington, D.C. At least most of the world believes that. So that kind of comparison and example of Libyan model was very rattling for North Korean regime. And I think that is where North Korean regime also lost its interest in the 12th June meeting. And then, of course, the air exercises that I just mentioned. So I think events were happening in such a fashion that, they were losing hope in what they can do by meeting on 12th of June. I was also hearing that President Trump was perhaps going to come through India after that meeting. That, of course, also is no longer the story now. So, many things that were building up in such a fashion that the hope was becoming hopelessness from what will happen on 12th of June is why they decided to postpone it, is how I look at it. But I want to underline that they have walked several miles together, and that experience is really going to help them in future when they restart this exercise again. And that is going to happen sooner than later.
Fair enough. And I suppose Ray Locker and Eugene, let me go to Eugene on that. Eugene, do you think also the South Korea factor is going to be very important if there is going to be a reset or a hitting of the restart button as far as the conversation between Mr. Trump and Kim Jong Un goes?
Absolutely. What the American government is able to do in terms of moving forward with finding a solution to the conflict between the U.S. government and North Korea is very much shaped by our relationship with South Korea. We're looking to them as our eyes and some level of support even in the region. And there's real concern also from the other side about how our actions and our conflicting relationship with North Korea's government can negatively impact South Korea. Obviously, there's real concern because of their proximity to the country and how radically the leader often finds himself behaving. And so where we go from here in terms of these conversations will likely include how South Korea will be affected by all of this and at worst how they could be harmed.
Okay, Eugene Scott, I believe we have to let go of you on that note. Thank you for joining us this evening and sharing your perspective with us. I'll request both my other guests to stay on with me, Professor Singh and, of course, Ray Locker. Before I go any further, I want to actually take our viewers through the quote-unquote tremendous anger and open hostility that President Trump was possibly referring to in the statement, in the letter that he's written to Kim Jong Un. One of North Korea's top leaders, the Vice Foreign Minister Cho Son-hui, issued earlier this week a statement that said, quote, whether the U.S. will meet us at a meeting point room or encounter us at nuclear-to-nuclear showdown is entirely dependent upon the decision and behavior of the United States, end quote. He also slammed the U.S. Vice President Mike Pence over his warning to Kim Jong Un, calling Pence a quote-unquote political dummy. In an interview, Pence had warned North Korea, saying it would be a great mistake to try and play Washington ahead of a planned summit with President Donald Trump. Pence said North Korea could end up like Libya if Kim Jong Un doesn't make a deal. The Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, remember, was killed in an uprising years after giving up atomic weapons. Let me go back to Ray Locker on that note. Ray, just coming back to those statements that have been made by different members of the Trump administration, Mike Pence, Mike Bolton, and John Bolton, pardon me, and of course the other Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. And then we look at President Trump's comments, just as far back as day before, when he was talking about the assurances that he's giving to the North Korean leader Kim Jong Un. Did that display to you perhaps a schism between the president and his men on how they wanted to tackle this summit and, of course, North Korea?
Yes, because I think that most of the people who are professionals in this world believe that the president acted on his own and acted impulsively. I think in the foreign policy and national security communities in Washington, there's a sense that Trump is not really informed about what's going on, likes the grand gesture, wants to be able to take credit for something happening without really knowing what's happening. We've seen this on China trade. We've seen this on auto tariffs on a variety of products. He makes statements and doesn't really back it up. People have to walk him back and come in and back and fill with various, details. And so when something as big as North Korea and nuclear weapons comes up, yes, there's tension inside the administration because people don't have confidence in what he's saying or that he knows what he's talking about.
Yes, and that was quite clear even on that day when he was issuing that brief, a joint statement with Moon Jae-in. There was, different points at which different things, it seems, were trying to be said by the president. I'm running out of time on this particular segment. I'll go to Professor Singh before I wrap up, though. Professor Singh, all in all, just looking at the way things have changed in the last few hours, we were going to talk about China's influence on the possibility of the talks, but Mr. Trump nixing all of that, saying that the talks are not going to happen at all. Do you still maintain, though, that there is the possibility of talks in the near future under President Trump before 2020?
I think since you mentioned China, they should be the people feeling certain amount of relief today, because talks were moving, momentum was so rapid that it was taking them by surprise. And that's why the two meetings that happened between President Xi Jinping and Kim Jong Un were required to kind of brief each other as to what was happening. But my feeling is that this is something which has a positive contribution to make. They had moved together, they have developed some understanding. North Korea has already made certain gestures, had already kind of eliminated a test site. So there is a momentum forward. Now, June 12th maybe was too quick, very impulsively agreed on both sides. They needed fundamentally some more time. And then they said, maybe we will agree on something there which will be implemented later. President Trump said in short time, but now it was looking even that is not possible. So it doesn't mean that this meeting is not happening means it's end of the whole conversation. I think at various levels, conversation will continue to happen. And it will go up again at senior level and maybe impulsively as well. Sometime President Trump may say something different. And let us wait, first of all, to see how North Korean leaders are responding. And the best part of this last 6 weeks has been, you now know various other names in North Korea. There are other voices that one can hear. There are other leaders who are engaging foreign leaders. And that's a change. So you're not talking to just one Kim Jong Un, but now we have a team of people there who foreign leaders, including Indian Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, has interacted and gone there. And that's a positive sign. And that in that sense, the closed-door regime is opening up and engaging the outside world. And I think something positive will be assessed over a period of time. But that's not end of the story to me. I think they have achieved certain amount of positive steps. They thought what they wanted cannot happen on 12th of June. Right. So they are basically buying more time.
Okay, and I guess in the meantime, we're just going to have to brace ourselves for a flurry of tweets. I'm sure the president has a lot more than just the official statement that he's issued to say on this entire issue. For now, though, I suppose the Singapore summit and that Nobel Peace Prize are off the table, at least temporarily. I'll thank both my guests on that note. Ray Locker from USA Today, joining us from Washington, and of course, Professor Swaran Singh of the Jawaharlal Nehru University, joining us from South Korea. Thank you both for taking out the time to speak with us here on the Fine Print. Now, before we go any further, at the Senate hearing, Mike Pompeo was asked if he thought Kim was a weak leader. This is what he said.
He has demonstrated an enormous capacity to lead his country and his team. So I don't think that's it. And frankly, I don't really know that I want to speculate as to why it is they took the actions, because I don't think we know. What I am hopeful is that we can continue to have conversations and put this back on track so that we can get to a place where we can achieve the outcome. I think it's worth. We talk a lot about summits and deals and the like. It's not about the deal. It's about the outcome. Right? It's about achieving this permanent physical change and transformation that will have the opportunity to change the world. And it is a corollary to that is a fundamental change in North Korea that would lead North Korea to have this opportunity for prosperity and good things, all the things that their neighbors to the south have. There will have to be a deal to get us to that point. But we shouldn't spend all our time thinking about the deal.
Right, and let's not forget these developments have come only hours after North Korea demonstrated once again how it was intending to stick to its end of the bargain. Remember, Pyongyang dismantled its nuclear test site at Punggye-ri earlier today. Reporters from around the world were invited, or I shouldn't say around the world, but some reporters were definitely invited for observing the dismantling of the test site. They said that at least 3 tunnels, observation buildings and staff quarters were blown up. North Korea invited journalists to watch the event, which was announced last month following the declaration of the Trump-Kim summit. North Korea has conducted 6 nuclear tests at this site in the mountains on the country's northeast. The site dismantled today was the only active nuclear test site in the world. Some experts say that the test site had already partially collapsed and was unusable in any case.